You went to the office that night with JR's gun. It was you, Kristen, who shot JR.
By the early 1980s, women started to enter the workforce en masse. This would have a profound effect on the labor market and add new talent to Western companies.
Up to Schultz. 5 seconds left in the game. Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
Gary Lee Rosenquist had camped out overnight at Bear Meadow, 8 miles northeast of Mount St. Helens. 27 years old and unemployed, he was hoping to get some good pictures of the mountain to help launch a career in photography. He got off to a good start. This sequence of photos was taken during the first 60 seconds of the mountain's eruption, beginning shortly after 8:30 on Sunday morning.
In 1980, Mr. Mugabe was elected prime minister.
In 1980, Marshal Joseph Tito, founder and longtime leader of Yugoslavia, died. This led to political infighting that often led to ethnic tensions within the party.
On May the 8th, 1980, the WHO declared the planet smallpox-free. After a millennia of terror, humanity's worst plague had been defeated.
Deng Xiaoping authorized 4 special economic zones in the south, carefully placed near the booming economies of Hong Kong and Taiwan. The government brought in electricity and built apartment blocks. Foreign companies were welcomed with financial incentives and allowed to use capitalist business methods. From all over the south, people poured in looking for jobs.
For the cable industry, whose pioneering spirit caused this great step forward in communications, I dedicate the Cable News Network.
Recently, there has been increased visibility on the part of a new moral majority, a religious component, and they are particularly politically active.
In 1980, the USSR hosted the Summer Olympics in Moscow. Due to the invasion of Afghanistan, the United States declined to participate.
The Polish economy was in crisis. There were shortages everywhere. Western loans had been squandered, and the country was burdened by foreign debt. When the government yet again raised food prices in the summer of 1980, workers at the Gdansk shipyard staged an illegal strike. The government negotiators gave way to the workers' key demand.
Deep in Iranian territory, Iraqi armor chalks up fresh successes on the battlefield. For once, an Arab army is inflicting territorial loss on the enemy. The enmity here between Arab and Persian, as old as that between Arab and Jew.
The Rubik Cube. Some people can do it, some can't. Vince Lipari has managed to find in the Bronx a 15-year-old who can do it.
Lenin was shot and killed at about 11 o'clock last night outside his apartment building.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
The Algerian 727 carrying the freed hostages left Athens about 1 hour ago. It's now over the Mediterranean.
And shots were fired, apparently at President Reagan, as he was coming out of the Washington Hilton Hotel this afternoon.
America's first space shuttle. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
People in Shanghai began to spend more. There wasn't much to buy at first, but gradually choice increased.
America! Demand your MTV! I want my MTV!
But the dark cloud of unemployment hangs over the lives of 11 million of our friends, neighbors, and family.
Is it the me generation gone wild, the height of antisocial behavior, electronic snubbery? Some still prefer last year's model, the radio that's about as big as the Empire State Building and as loud as World War II.
International banks froze all GDR assets because of Polish and Romanian insolvency. Hectic crisis management began. Products had to be exported at all costs. The lack of competitive alternatives forced the GDR to switch to petroleum products. Western imports were reduced below the pain threshold.
I must tell those who failed to report for duty this morning, they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
But the economy did not behave in the way the monetarists predicted. The squeeze on money led to a wave of factory closures, while inflation continued to rise.
Industry experts say we're no longer on the verge of the personal computer revolution. We're right in the midst of it, thank you, and it's gathering steam with more and more people jumping aboard every day.
Anwar Sadat, peacemaker of Egypt, killed in a military assassination.
Hong Kong, the booming center of international business, was also one of the last remnants of British colonial rule. At the end of the 19th century,
the British had forced the Chinese to lease them most of Hong Kong's territory for 99 years. In the early 1980s, investors began to worry about what would happen when the lease expired in 1997.
In 1981, in response to mounting public and economic pressures facing the country, the Polish army launched a coup that overthrew the civilian government and banned Solidarity.
Come on in. It's almost another world here in the video arcades.
The biggest challenge that faced Mrs. Thatcher was the Falklands conflict, the battle with Argentina over the Falkland Islands that cost hundreds of lives.
E.T. phone home? E.T. phone home.
As finance minister in 1982, Jesus Silva Herzog Flores broke the news to the world that Mexico would hold repayment of its debt, triggering a continent-wide crisis.
By the early 80s, international opposition to apartheid had grown rapidly. Boycotts, pressures for corporations to divest, sanctions, and mass protests put pressure on the South African government to democratize. However, they remained firm in their opposition to reform. The Mexican debt crisis led to its spreading across Latin America, including in Chile. GDP contracted by 14%, unemployment soared to 24%, and this led to a wave of protests against the regime, as well as a relaxation of neoliberal policies. More focus on personal appearance and the rise of supermodels and plastic surgery led to a greater number of people exercising regularly. Home workout videos became especially popular.
Bobby Campbell of San Francisco and Billy Walker of New York both suffer from a mysterious, newly discovered disease which affects mostly homosexual men.
The aging Kremlin rulers were still willing to bear the crippling cost of being a superpower. Both sides were constantly introducing more powerful and accurate missiles.
Our program brings down income tax rates 25%. At the same time, we've been cutting costly, wasteful government regulations and the rate of increase in government spending.
By the 80s, Soviet computing had fallen behind the West. Soviet computers were often shoddy clones of Western ones or used mainframes rather than GUI interfaces.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
Afternoon, everybody.
Oh, no! How's life treating you, Norm?
He caught me in bed with his wife.
President Reagan gave the go-ahead to develop a space-age system designed to neutralize an enemy nuclear missile attack.
With the escalation of tensions, a mood of crisis now gripped both East and West. Arms control negotiations were broken off.
Driving the bears back into permanent hibernation. That's our economic program for the next 4 years. We're going to turn the bull loose.
10-year-old Samantha Smith has become a national figure since receiving a reply to her letter from the Soviet leader. She's been whisked around the country in private planes, asked to address peace rallies, and has made numerous appearances on American television.
In July 1983, martial law ended in Poland. The oppression of civil liberties led to sanctions and economic decline, leading thousands of Poles to leave Poland for the West.
In the 80s, foreign competition and computer technology revolutionized manufacturing by introducing more automated and computer-guided manufacturing processes. These led to plants needing more robots and fewer people, as well as increases in company profits and productivity. In Romania, citizens suffered from shortages of everything from staple foods to electricity, as Ceausescu exported everything his country had to repay foreign debts acquired for industrial investments made in the 70s.
Thatcher wanted to end their dependence on government subsidies and submit them to the discipline of the marketplace.
The nationalist industries fell to pieces. They lost huge sums of money. They put the prices up massively and still weren't able to make a profit. They were bleeding the nation dry, the taxpayer dry.
Japan and the United States claim a Soviet fighter shot down the Korean Airlines jumbo jet with a missile. 269 people are believed to have perished.
The rise in nuclear tensions between the two superpowers in the early 80s led to a resurgence in the anti-nuclear movement. Tens of thousands, particularly in Western Europe, protested arms development and deployment and called for mutual disarmament.
Grenada was ruled by an elected but corrupt right-wing government. Then a bloodless left-wing coup put a Marxist revolutionary government into power. The Americans invaded. The days of the revolutionary government were over.
A list of survivors, dead and wounded, is still being compiled, but the disaster is by far the worst since the Marines have been in Lebanon.
Never in the history of the world has a nation changed with such speed and magnitude. This was communism's new revolution.
They take about 30 minutes to reach their target. So do theirs, right?
Missile warning, this is Beale. Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high. Roger, we've got 32 targets in track and 10 impacting points.
It's a step forward in terms of the way it uses graphics and the speed, and this is a machine that a lot of people are going to be able to afford.
On the streets of New York, it's called crack. It produces an intense high and leaves the user craving for more.
In March 1984, Yuri Andropov died. His successor, Konstantin Chernenko, was too frail to establish a dialogue.
All over the United States and Western Europe, factories closed and workers lost their jobs to new competitors.
How long have you been breakdancing?
Well, I don't actually breakdance. I do electric boogie and popping for about 3.5 months now.
And you just started doing this?
Just really started getting into it.
Did you hurt yourself in the beginning?
Well, it's really hard to hurt yourself doing electric boogie, but breaking, you can hurt yourself if you don't really know what you're doing at the start.
The common market has become the biggest commercial body in the world, bigger than Russia and the United States combined, having cornered 37% of all global trade, compared to 13% for the United States. But for all this, Europe is not united, not in politics, language, culture, or religion. And there is not yet a common currency.
Nicaragua is a communist dictatorship armed to the teeth, tied to Cuba and the Soviet Union, which oppresses its people and threatens its neighbors. The stability of our Latin friends, indeed the security of our own borders, depends upon which type of society prevails. I sent the Congress in February a proposal to encourage democratic institutions, improve living conditions, and help our friends in Central America resist communist threats.
The violence starts when a police Land Rover is trapped in the crowd, who begin to kick and stone it. Then the police open fire with shotguns. In the last 2 months, 60 people have died in the Cape Town area alone.
The striking miners took their protest to London today, and by the time it was over, 120 people had been arrested, including an MP, Dave Nellist.
It's simple. A mathematically based puzzle of falling blocks, which players have to coordinate and fill a line without gaps.
They were exceptionally memorable games. First time that some athletes were doing commercial endorsements.
Right.
We had the first color TV games.
As so often in the past, trade between the two Germanies brought relief to the crises. No foreign exchange was needed. Accounting was settled by balancing the value of goods received against the goods delivered. The GDR enjoyed advantages no other Comecom member shared, but even this was no longer enough. A helping hand came from a surprising quarter. With the support of Franz Josef Strauss, West Germany granted credits totaling 2 billion marks in 1983 and 1984. This made the GDR internationally creditworthy again.
Money now became a commodity traded for itself. It was managed by young technicians in the dealing rooms. Economists who once thought they could control money became its servants. They were now employed in their hundreds by the banks to predict on television what might or might not happen as a result of the colossal flows of capital.
Finally, Deng Xiaoping proposed the idea of one country, two systems, and broke the impasse. China would recover Hong Kong, but the territory would keep its capitalist economic system.
Indira Gandhi, ruler of the world's largest democracy, died today, shot down by 2 of her own bodyguards. They were Sikhs taking revenge for the invasion of their temple in June, and tonight mobs of Hindus have been attacking Sikhs in cities throughout the subcontinent.
VHS and Betamax competed to dominate the new home video market, with Betamax offering a sharper picture. However, VHS ultimately won due to, among other factors, its longer recording ability.
The world's new consumers all aspired to the same goal, the choice and abundance of the West. For all its insecurity, the capitalist system with its materialist values was continuing to generate unprecedented wealth.
World leaders paid their respects to Mikhail Gorbachev and weighed up the new, younger man in charge of the Soviet Union. To revive a decrepit economy, Gorbachev called for reconstruction, or perestroika, and a new spirit of honesty, glasnost. Russians, too, noticed the difference.
The social structures directly turned public opinion against the regime.
through the distribution of anti-government propaganda to their members. The role played by both the armed forces and former ruling party members in ultimately bringing the Brazilian democratic movement to power demonstrates the importance of elite participation in regime change and democratization efforts.
The Indian economy in the 80s was characterized by continued slow growth and heavy state involvement in key industrial and service sectors. Although living standards were rising, India saw itself surpassed by China and the East Asian tigers, but about on par with its immediate neighbors.
It was increasingly hard to maintain the same dictatorial grip with which the miracle had begun. Industrial workers mounted strikes demanding huge pay rises. Students fought with police.
In 1985, South Africa declared a state of emergency due to unrest and economic decline as a last gasp to stay in power. This led to a militarization of daily life, international condemnation, and increased violence from resistance groups. In the 80s, shopping malls became popular as people wanted to shop for a greater variety of products in a more centralized location. This led to increased sales for often larger businesses, but many main streets in American and Western European cities suffered heavily.
If you have one of these, and you have one of these, but you don't have one of these, you're missing half the fun of owning a computer. This is a modem, and with it you can turn your computer into a window on the world. How? Well, we'll find out today as we take a look at modems and bulletin boards.
Calls were still coming in to Live Aid's telethon phone banks on Sunday. People were still donating money to the African famine relief effort.
US President Ronald Reagan and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev met for the first time at the Geneva summit.
Due to the Thai baht devaluation in 1975 and relative political stability in the region, exports and foreign direct investment soared in Thailand and Southeast Asia. This led to the production of more highly value-added products and the beginning of sustained economic growth region-wide.
It may be the most addictive toy in history, and it's definitely the hottest thing this Christmas. Nintendo video games. They first arrived from Japan, and now millions of American kids are hooked and mesmerized.
We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
We had this brilliant idea that we were going to come to Pakistan and create a force of mujahideen, equip them with Stinger missiles and everything else to go after the Soviets inside Afghanistan.
Massive quantities of radiation have apparently been released in an accident at the Chernobyl power station in the Ukraine.
In barely 3 decades, Japan went from being a war-torn country to becoming an industrial and financial powerhouse. The feeling of prosperity was so intense that, at the time, forecasts indicated that sooner or later, the Japanese economy would even outgrow the economy of the United States.
I was asked by a group of children what to do if they were offered drugs. And I answered, just say no.
Instead of acting disappointed, because I'm not like you, maybe you can just accept who I am and love me anyway, because I'm your son.
Theo, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. There's no wonder you get D's and everything.
With stagnating real incomes, Americans and Western Europeans began to work more and take on more debt. This was exemplified as during the 80s, American credit card debt rose by a factor of 5.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which anyone raised or lowered? Raised tariffs.
Satellite and cable media, the fax machine, and the computer opened up the USSR to the rest of the world. This was exemplified by the 1986 Goodwill Games being hosted in Moscow and broadcasted worldwide.
In 1986, Vietnam decided to follow in China's footsteps in economic opening and liberalization through a policy called Doi Moi. Foreign investment from East and Southeast Asia poured in, and the country began to urbanize faster than ever before. The war on drugs and a more aggressive police force, often targeting people of color in poor neighborhoods, led to an explosion in the prison population. However, harsh sentences and few resources to rehabilitate those incarcerated led to a revolving door into and out of prison and further depressed already hard-hit inner cities.
While American consumers are enjoying the benefits of oversupply and lower prices, the oil business in this country is hurting. 4 months ago, the price of West Texas crude oil was almost $31 a barrel. Today, it was just over $13.
There were efforts to develop a video game industry within the Eastern Bloc. People obtained systems by ordering kits in the mail, and the quality remained about 5 years behind that of the West.
It has been quite a time for the yuppie, the young, upwardly mobile professional. What with someone putting out a yuppie handbook and with Newsweek making the yuppie a cover story.
Reagan met Gorbachev for the second time in a hastily called summit at Reykjavik, Iceland.
For the first time, the two leaders really had a deep conversation.
Jiang Shuwei decided to leave her family in Hunan and join what would grow into the greatest peacetime migration in history.
Soviet television was changing as it opened up to the rest of the world. It risked a live debate with Thatcher in 1987.
So don't you think that the concept of nuclear deterrence, in fact, invites the side that believes in it to use the nuclear weapons in the end, just to prove this threat from time to time?
One by one, the Thatcher government put the commanding heights of the British economy up for sale. Electricity, telephones, oil, gas, coal, steel, trains and planes, and even water were all privatized. Other Western European countries soon followed suit with their own privatization efforts.
For billions of years, our only protection from the damaging effects of radiation has been in the upper atmosphere. High concentrations of a gas called ozone form a natural protective covering. However, this ozone layer is fragile. If you compressed all the ozone particles at sea level, the layer would only be 1/10 of an inch thick. There's evidence that the ozone layer in the upper atmosphere is diminishing. Scientists have discovered an unpredicted huge gap over Antarctica. Over the Arctic, there's the possibility of another smaller hole.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Colonel North, you were involved in 2 operations, and one of them involved the support of the Contras, and another one involved the sale of arms to Iran.
The continuing violation of human rights brought condemnation of the South Korean government from abroad. And in 1987, after 26 years of military rule, free elections were held.
Scenes like this are becoming commonplace in U.S. cities where cellular is available today. Right now, businessmen and women are major users of radio telephones where cellular is in service. But more people will take advantage of cellular as its benefits become apparent.
Income inequality soared in the 80s as those in the top 10% and 1% of income benefited from a booming stock market, and the poor struggled as a result of cuts to social services and a lack of investment in inner cities.
Conservatives in the party responded to Deng's successes with mixed feelings. The money-oriented lifestyles of Hong Kong and the special economic zones went against everything their revolution stood for.
I'm at the Capitol Mall where the NAMES Project AIDS quilt is to be unveiled. Each panel of this huge 2-city block quilt bears the name of someone who has died of AIDS. As the panel is unfolded, the names will be read aloud. There are over 2,000 names on this quilt here today.
So many returned illegally. Unemployment continues to be a problem in every Western European country. Today, governments look for ways to create employment.
Soviet rock and punk music took off in the 80s as a result of glasnost. Millions came to watch top bands play large and loud public rock concerts for the first time.
A new breed of young people was created by our intellectuals, a breed that rejected all our Soviet past. This was moral degradation.
Today is Black Monday, the day the Dow dropped more than 500 points, the day the Dow dropped more than 22%.
Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed a far-reaching agreement. For the first time, an entire category of nuclear weapons was to be abolished.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
And Mr. Mugabe became president, pursuing his increasingly authoritarian policies.
By the late 80s, there was some recovery in the Polish economy, with GDP per capita surpassing $6,000 in 1988. However, Poland financed this growth with more debt, leading to a greater need to export goods and thus more consumer goods shortages. The country's lag behind Western Europe continued.
Gorbachev reacted to growing opposition by pressing ahead with plans to reform the Communist Party.
By 1988, American attitudes toward the Soviet Union were improving. This was exemplified when Reagan visited Moscow that year.
You still think you're in an evil empire, Mr. President?
No. We find ourselves standing like this.
Together, the two leaders had seized their chance.
The Western high-tech embargo drove the GDR into a crash microelectronics program, thanks in part to industrial espionage in the West. Despite massive investment, East Germany never reached world standards. Production of a 1 megabyte chip was lavishly celebrated in 1988.
The law on cooperatives was the first timid attempt to allow private entrepreneurship in the Soviet Union.
Thousands of small cooperatives sprang up all across the USSR in every industry from clothing to computers. Advertising started to appear for the first time on Soviet TV, and some enterprising Soviets became the country's first millionaires.
My brother just got the most critically acclaimed, top-rated compact disc player, a Magnavox.
Sounds good, too.
No other CD players won more awards for flawless sound.
Sounds good, too.
Audio experts say nothing even comes close.
It sounds great.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
In 1988, it was the South Koreans' turn to host the Olympic Games. Now they had a chance to show the world their prosperity.
Today was day one of the long-awaited ceasefire in the Persian Gulf War. Iraq has charged Iran with one ceasefire violation, but for all practical purposes, the truce seems to be holding.
In 1988, the U.S. unveiled the world's first stealth fighter, the Lockheed F-117, which made the plane nearly invisible to radar detection.
The planned economy had become second nature to bureaucrats at all levels. They could distribute things, but they couldn't turn in a profit. New economic programs were not working.
The Bakers were a prominent televangelical couple who made millions from their widely viewed TV show. However, scandal arose when Jim Baker was alleged to have raped his secretary. The Bakers were also accused of defrauding their customers, and Jim Baker was ultimately sentenced to 45 years, serving only 5, while his wife would divorce him.
Excel is a very different sort of product than 123 or even 123 Release 3. It's designed to take advantage of the 286 and 386 processing power that most new computers have, and it uses those to display graphics or bits of information instead of characters.
Economically, we accumulated by that time a huge debt. Politically, all the key players within the country realized that there is no way to get a better life via reforming the socialist model.
In Hungary, frustrated citizens began protesting for more political and economic freedoms, especially the right to travel. Fear drove the regime to promise political change, especially more democracy.
Such a big mouth. No, I don't.
Faced with a wave of political strikes led by the opposition movement Solidarity, the regime had given way. The government opened round-table talks with Solidarity. The Polish communists were prepared to share power.
The retreat of Soviet military power from Afghanistan is complete. The last of Russia's regular army invasion force is out.
The difference in power between somebody who's got the internet and somebody who hasn't is now huge.
Will you repeat the 56 exercise or not? And Gorbachev, without hesitation, responded quite clearly to me. I don't agree with the multi-party system, the introduction of the multi-party system in Hungary. But that's not my responsibility, that's your responsibility.
It's not only the worst oil spill in U.S. history, it's by far the largest in such a remote, pristine area. The tanker, the Exxon Valdez, had just loaded more than 1 million barrels of Alaskan crude. It was about 25 miles from the Valdez terminal when it ran aground.
Introducing Game Boy. It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable.
In June, elections were held. Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. Already in communist China, a surge of demands for human rights and democracy had ended in tragedy.
By the late 80s, Eastern Bloc investments in computing technology had paid off as computers began to enter schools and offices. They were often clones of Western models and lagged behind in memory and processing power. A communist country that had been preaching friendship and unity among its people for nearly 70 years saw its first serious ethnic disturbances. These turned into a massive wave in the Soviet borderlands that further strained the massive empire.
The Hungarian government took down the barbed wire on its border with Austria and the West. The Soviet Union did nothing. Although travel was still not completely free, the Iron Curtain was starting to unravel. At the Warsaw Pact summit, the leaders were divided. Honecker, like Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu, was alarmed by what was happening in Poland and Hungary.
Honecker, and particularly Ceausescu, were against our reforms.
In July, President Bush visited Poland and Hungary. The West gave them moral support for democratic change, but little more.
East Germans besieged the West German embassy in Hungary, begging for help to emigrate.
The refugees could go to West Germany, but only if their train crossed East German territory first. Then Honecker could claim that he had expelled them and cancelled their citizenship.
That now promises to be the almost certain selection by Polish President Jaruzelski of a non-communist member of the Solidarity Trade Union as the next Prime Minister of Poland.
The Soviet Union's first mass strikes began in the coal mining areas. On one occasion, 500,000 workers in various parts of the country went on strike almost simultaneously. Many coal mines were given a measure of independence. Basically, that's what compelled them to strike.
In removing the market controls over the kinds of investments the banks and the S&Ls could make, the government also cut down the number of examiners who were there to protect the public.
In Leipzig, the police struck back. On September the 4th, Western journalists filmed plainclothes security men as they attacked the demonstrators.
A wave of strikes and protests demanding a curb on rising prices swept the USSR. Due to improving relations and the new liberal Soviet attitude towards its satellites in Eastern Europe, Secretary of State Baker confirmed to Soviet Minister Shevardnadze that the US wouldn't exploit Soviet problems there.
Demonstrations in Berlin continued.
Rationing was introduced in the Soviet Union in 1989, for the first time since the end of World War II.
The outward show of victorious celebration went ahead. Then, at the torchlight parade of communist youth, the marchers dropped their rehearsed slogans. They began to chant another name, Gorby.
The Leipzig communists begged the opposition to talk with them. Then, without higher orders, they pulled back the East German police and troops. For East Germans, this was the turning point.
In vain, Krentz offered new freedoms. The street demonstrations grew bigger and asked for more. In East Berlin on November the 4th, a crowd of 500,000 people gathered. On November the 9th, 1989, Günter Schabowski told journalists in Berlin that restrictions on travel to the West would be lifted. Suddenly, the guards gave in. They opened the barriers. West Berliners arrived from the other direction. They began to demolish the wall in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Protesters in Prague were persistent and good-humored. They jangled keys to make their point to the government. Your time is up.
Bush and Gorbachev met to end the Cold War. However, for Gorbachev, beset by problems at home, the question was, would the Soviet Union itself survive?
It worked.
A sekretariátu UVKSČ
Secretariat of the Central Committee
dávají své funkce k dispozici.
Before the year's end, Václav Havel was elected president of Czechoslovakia. People called it the Velvet Revolution because not one drop of blood had been spilled.
In mid-December, during riots against the communist regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, security forces shot dead 73 men and women. The tyrant Ceausescu was ruthless in suppressing opposition.
Meanwhile, hey, Walmart! But there's one left and it's mine!
A force of about 26,000 American soldiers invaded Panama in Operation Just Cause. General Manuel Noriega, who had ruled the country from 1983 to 1989, was removed from power, arrested, and brought to the United States for trial.
The crowd began to jeer. State television took the pictures off the air. Crowds stormed the Central Committee building and charged upstairs. Ceausescu and his wife escaped by helicopter. In the muddle and confusion that followed, different factions fought it out in the streets. The Ceausescus were tried by court-martial.
Unanimitate de voturi pe inculpații Ceaușescu Nicolae și Ceaușescu Elena la pedeapsa capitală și confiscarea totală a averii pentru săvârșirea